Thank you, Tim and Marilyn and Judy. Good evening, church. Good evening, church. There you are. I knew you were out there somewhere. Did you have a good afternoon? Bless you. Okay. Let it all come out. I had a friend years ago who sneezed like this. And I never could figure out that. I figured when she was 30 years old, she was just going to explode. You know? Did you have a good week? Did you have a tough day this week? I had a tough day this week. Did this ever happen to you? I woke up, got out of the bed, looked at the clock. As I was walking across my living room, I thought to myself, it's unusually light in here for some reason. And I looked at the clock, and the clock said 7:18. And I went, oh, everybody up, let's go, let's go, let's go. Got in a rush and put everything together, ran down here and got into the office late and started my computer up, started Outlook, and realized I had a meeting and I had to be somewhere else. I was out of here. Just the day didn't start out good. I don't guess you had a day like that this week, huh? Wanda did. Wanda had one like that. Of course, I didn't end up with Band-Aids on my face, so I guess I'm doing good, huh? It'll heal. Keep it up. All right. We look for I tried to convince Karen not to put that picture up there. You like that picture? Okay. I'm glad she used it then. Does that look like an intolerant face to you? Okay, so she pegged it then, huh? We spent a couple of weeks asking the question, have we made Christianity offensive? And the answer was no, we haven't, but the Christian message is offensive to some people. Just because of the content of the message. It says you have a serious problem, and it requires a serious answer. Even Jesus, when he proclaimed the message clearly and in the power of the Holy Spirit, like only he can do, offended people. And we saw that the main conclusion was that we should, like Jesus, we should be careful and make sure that we are proclaiming the message accurately. We don't want to be offensive unnecessarily. But once we've clarified the message and they've gotten it, if they're offended by the message, we have no mandate to change that message. There's nothing we can do or should do to try to make the message any more palatable to the people around us. If the contents of the Christian message itself is offensive to them, then we just have to pray that they'll go away and think about that and change their mind, and God will break down those barriers. But there's another charge. In fact, there's two more charges against Christianity that I'd like to talk about. The next one is this one. Is Christianity intolerant? Some people say that it is, that it's an intolerant religion, an intolerant belief system. So I'd like to spend some time talking about that tonight, or maybe next week if we need that much time. What does it mean to be intolerant? How would you define either the word intolerant or, conversely, the word tolerant? Somebody give us a definition. What does it mean to be tolerant? Accepting. Okay. Somebody else?
I think it means accepting things that you don't agree with or you don't approve of.
Accepting things that you don't agree with or don't approve of. Okay? Somebody else?
Letting it be around.
Pardon?
Letting it exist.
Letting it exist, something that you don't agree with or approve of. To match that back to Gary Loney. Okay? Somebody else? Compromise. Interesting. How do you define tolerance or intolerance? Kathleen?
Chesterton quoted, and this is a quote from him, he says, "Tolerance is a virtue of a man with no convictions."
Tolerance is a virtue of a man with no convictions. So ladies, you're free. Inclusive. A person with no convictions. That's pretty sweeping. So according to this person, if we're tolerant, then we don't have any convictions. That might depend on how we define the word tolerant, though. And that's going to be the crux of this issue too, is what does it really mean to be tolerant or intolerant? Listen to this story. This is a news story. Some of you may have already heard it. Aaron and Melissa Klein of Portland, Oregon, owned a little bakery called Sweet Cakes by Melissa. And they are devout Christians. So when a lesbian couple came and asked them to make a gay wedding cake, that's weird, a gay wedding cake? Anyway, that's what they asked them for. They turned down the job because they believe that marriage is a sacrament, that it's holy, and their religious beliefs as devout Christians would not allow them to engage in that. There were plenty of other bakeries around who would have taken the job. Instead, the gay couple did what? You've heard the story, or one like it. The gay couple filed a civil rights complaint, and the Kleins began to suffer protests by gay groups. They were accused of being bigots, and even their children received death threats. Wow. They finally had to close down their bakery and decided to work out of their home. Then, the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries ruled that they violated the lesbian couple's civil rights, and they have to make a settlement to them. I don't know how much. Under state law, only religious organizations have a right to deny service based on sexual orientation, not individual business owners, etc. Who is the intolerant one in that story? Why do you say that?
Because they did not allow the bakery to have their own convictions.
Okay, Tammy says the lesbian couple is actually the ones who are the intolerant ones because they didn't allow the owners of the bakery to have their own
They're trying to
convictions.
force them to accept their lifestyle.
Trying to force them to accept their lifestyle. Who is the intolerant one in that story? Anybody else? Somebody want to disagree with Tammy? It's okay, Greg does it all the time.
You didn't hear me.
Would you say Earl?
Or no.
Would the government be the justice system?
The justice system. I hadn't considered that. They seem to be have a role in all of this. They're supposed to be a reflection of all of us, aren't they? Of our values, our shared values as Americans. It's getting a little difficult to decide what our shared values are. There's worse things than being intolerant, but in our culture, it's a pretty bad thing. No, we don't. No, we don't. So who is the intolerant one? The UN issued a statement in 1995 about tolerance. Listen carefully to this. 1995 was called the Year of Tolerance, and tolerance was declared to be, quote, respect, acceptance, and appreciation of the rich diversity of our world's cultures, our forms of expression, and ways of being human, end quote. What do you think about that definition of tolerance? Respect, acceptance, and appreciation of the rich diversity of our world's cultures, our forms of expression, and ways of being human. Is that a good definition of tolerance? I see some people doing this.
Well, I mean, there's parts of it. I can respect your choices without agreeing with them.
Respect your choices without agreeing with them. Okay? Somebody else? Does that pretty well say it? Let's open our Bibles and think about this for a minute. Y'all have said some good things. I'm glad that either you're just intuitive or you've already thought about this some. But we'll all spend some time thinking about this because it's a live topic in pop culture, in our culture today, about Christianity and tolerance and offensiveness, and a third topic that we'll talk about as well. We're in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 24. Matthew 13:24 says this, Another parable he placed before them, saying, the kingdom of the heavens has become like a man sowing good seed in his field. Giving it to you rather literally, you can look at your English translation and see how it matches up with a real literal rendering of the Greek text. One of the unusual things about the Greek in this particular chapter, and it happens 2 or 3 times, Jesus says, this is a chapter full of Jesus' parables, and he says the kingdom of heaven is like, in some places. In other places he says the kingdom of the heavens has become like. And I'm not sure many of our English translations bother showing the distinction, but this is one of the places where he says the kingdom of the heavens has become like. So think about that as we look at this parable and see if maybe there is a reason for that distinction. Did Jesus say that for a reason here, or is it just a stylistic thing? Now, on what basis, if we're going to make a judgment about Christianity as a world movement, if we're going to talk about whether Christianity is tolerant or intolerant, offensive or not, how do we do that? On what basis should we judge Christianity? What do you think? How do we judge Christianity? What do we look at? Okay, Kathleen says the Bible. Would you agree with that? If we're going to judge Christianity, we've got to look at the Bible, at least as part of the evidence. Is there anything else that we need to look at? Is there anything specific in the Bible that we need to look at? Jesus' salvation. The Bible is an unfolding revelation. Would it be fair to judge Christianity based on the book of Leviticus? I'll ask that question again. Would it be fair to judge Christianity based on the book of Leviticus? Okay. I was getting worried there for a minute. Wesley got it right. Somebody else did too.
In the great commandment, love.
That's in Deuteronomy. So, it may be in Leviticus too, but do we judge Christianity based on that one commandment?
But the theme of the Bible is love.
Okay, we should judge on the whole Bible. What'd you say?
I said the theme of the Bible is love because God is love.
The theme of the Bible is love because God is love. I'd have to say yes to that because you'd think I was nuts if I said no.
That's right.
But I think we need not to mention the fact that it's my father. And since we're in the Old Testament, there's something about honoring your father and your mother. I think that's even in the New Testament, so. That's true, but that's like writing a paper in school. Now, stay with me, because I know a lot of you are like, no, we don't want to go to school. But just for a minute, stay with me. Put yourself back. I know this is very painful, but put yourself back in that English class, back in high school, or even in college, and you're writing a theme, and you turn in the subject to your teacher, and the teacher says what? It's too what? It's too broad. Vague, yeah, but it's too broad. It's too big. Can we be more specific? Can we be more specific about what the message of the Bible is? Yes, the message of the Bible is love and God is love, but how can we make that more specific? What? Use adjectives. We are back in English class. It's very love.
But it's the Bible's about the love that God had for us.
Okay, that's better.
It's agape love.
Agape love, that's even better. Now we're back to the New Testament. I like that. Thank you.
But it's the love that He had that poured out. He did not want to be separated from us, so He provided a way for us to be rejoined with Him.
Oh, that's getting better all the time.
Don't we call that redemption?
That it is, but what is it driven by?
Love.
The sacrifice of Christ.
What is? That's exactly right. I think it's important for all. I know that it's important for all of us to know the don't get scared by this word, the meta-narrative, the big narrative, the big picture, the big story of the Bible. And it really isn't that complicated. God made everything, and he made people, and he loved them, but they did what? They sinned, and so they were doomed. And so God spent the rest of the Bible doing what? Providing salvation. That's the story of the Bible right there. Now we can start filling in the details, but that is the story of the Bible, and we want to know that so that we can represent Christianity well. Yes, God is love, and the Bible is about love, but the Bible is about God's love being rejected, but God's love overcoming. I don't want to get too close to Rob Bell's title here in what I'm saying, but love does win out, but there is a hell. There are real choices that have to be made here. The Bible is, it's about redemption, and redemption is driven by God's love. So we want to make sure that we represent the Bible fairly and not too vaguely. But if we're going to judge the Bible and judge Christianity, ultimately we have to judge it based on what? We're back to that question again. Can we judge it based on the book of Psalms? Only in part. Can we judge it based on the book of Revelation?
I think that's based on the whole Bible.
The whole Bible, absolutely. Is there any part of the Bible that is maybe more important?
The gospel.
This is a dangerous question, I know. But yeah, the Gospels are important. Why are the Gospels critical? They're the teachings of Christ, but why are they important when it comes to understanding?
Because it's the story of his sacrifice.
Yes, but why is that important?
It's an example.
It's what we must do to be saved.
Redemption, what?
What we must do to be saved.
Is what we have to do to be saved. All those are good, all those are right answers. But ultimately the reason that Jesus is the key is because through him we understand the rest of what? The rest of the Bible. Jesus is the key to understanding the whole Bible. Without Jesus, we don't fully understand Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, etc. all the way through. Once Jesus is put into place, it's like the last tumbler in the lock comes in and the whole thing turns and the door opens. Before that time, we're working toward that. That is a revelation that is unfolding. It's an unfolding revelation, and Jesus is the final and full revelation of who God is. Now, that's critical for us to understand, because if we're going to defend the gospel as we're supposed to do, then we need to understand that the key to knowing what the gospel says is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is how we judge what Christianity is. Now, to some degree, maybe we could judge Christians. The world is judging Christianity by Christians a lot of times. And that's okay. To some degree we should do that. But why is that not enough?
People aren't Jesus.
Because Christians are not perfect. That's exactly right. So we can't fully judge Christianity by Christians. We have to have something else, and that something else is Jesus. Here's the first thing I'd like you to write down on your outlines, and that is this. On what basis should Christianity be judged? And this is it. Christianity should be judged by the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. If you get into a situation where you're defending Christianity in the world, and I hope you do, I want you to. I'm counting on it, and I want you to feel comfortable doing that. When you get into a situation in the classroom, at the workplace, with your family, friends, in the neighborhood, wherever it might be, where you get into a situation where Christianity is being charged with intolerance, offensiveness, whatever, and you're there to defend Christianity, your defense of Christianity is got to be based on the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Because that's the standard for what Christianity is. If somebody is doing something that is very different from the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter if they call themselves Christians. It just causes confusion. And we should point that out. We should point out to somebody, if they begin to judge Christianity based on a church that has a website called GodHatesFags.com, we need to say, well, now wait a minute. Jesus never had a website that said GodHatesFags.com. He didn't even think that way or feel that way. That's not a fair representation of the teaching and the life of Jesus Christ. And that's the first question we should ask ourselves when somebody says, well, Christians blank. We should ask ourselves, is that a fair representation of the teaching and the life of Jesus Christ? If it's not, then we're the ones who have to step up and say, no. And let me tell you why. Obviously we have to know the teachings and the life of Jesus Christ. Now, what I want to do in this series is I want to use Islam again as a foil, because there are really strange things happening in the world. I know that you've noticed it. Some odd things are being said. I want to use some phrases out of Obama's speech at the UN recently. He said some interesting things. Here's one little clip. Tell me what you think about this. Now, he's talking about ISIS and trying to gather a coalition to defeat this movement in Iraq and Syria. You've seen James Foley's head cut off and these other people. You know what's going on. I hope you're keeping up with all of this. It's a group that claims to be Islamic, and there's a lot of people in the West bending over backward to say it's not Islam, that they don't represent Islam at all. But here's just one little phrase. I know I'm taking them out of context, so I apologize ahead of time. But here's the phrase from the president in his speech. There is nothing new about wars within religions. Christianity endured centuries of vicious sectarian conflict. End quote. Listen again. What do you think about this statement? There is nothing new about wars within religions. Christianity endured centuries of vicious sectarian conflict. End quote. What do you think about that? That's the first part. That's exactly right. The first part is that he is comparing Christianity and Islam. And what does his comparison imply?
We are equal in our vicious intolerance.
That we are equal in our vicious intolerance. Somebody else?
He justifies what they're doing.
It justifies what they're doing?
Oh, more than that, or that's what it's.
It could. So what is the subtext to what Obama is saying?
He's trying to say that Christians, we're all just a sect.
We're all just a sect. We're all just the what? We're all the same. We're all alike. Christianity is no better than Islam. All we have to do is look at the right place in history, and we look just as bad as they do.
If somebody said that about race, that would start a war. I mean, come on, you can say that just because one person does something, you can't judge an entire people over something one person did or something that happened in the history of.
Okay. So is it fair to judge Christianity? First of all, what's he talking about?
The Crusades.
Centuries of vicious sectarian conflict. The Crusades are not sectarian conflict. Sectarian conflict is conflict within. So he's not even referring to the Crusades.
What else could it be?
Protestant Reformation.
Protestant Catholic, okay. We've looked at that in here before, the time of the Reformation, and there was a lot of sectarian conflict. Does it equal what's going on in Islam today? I don't know. It doesn't look like it. But any kind of violence, though, is what? How are we going to judge Christianity again? By the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. So when we look at vicious sectarian conflict within Christian groups, what is our immediate response?
That's not who Christ is.
That does not line up with the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so those who are engaged in vicious sectarian conflict are not reflecting the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. They really don't deserve to call themselves representatives of Jesus or of Christianity, at least not at that moment they don't, because they're not doing what Jesus called them to do. Okay, does that sound fair? Am I right? Am I right?
It's hard for the world to judge Christianity by looking at other neighbors.
Now, Tim makes a good point, though, and this is what we have to consider, that it's hard for the world to judge Christianity by anything except for Christians. But let's go back to that vicious sectarian conflict back in the Reformation period in the 1500s and 1600s between Protestants and Catholics. It wasn't just Protestants and Catholics. And those of you that sat through the series, you may have forgotten it by now, but I would just feel so good for 2 or 3 days if you could remember what I'm fixing to ask you. In those vicious sectarian conflicts in Europe during the 15 and 1600s, there was the Catholic Church, and there was the Protestant Church, and there were who? Yeah, Church of England. That's technically, you're right, but it might as well have been part of Catholicism. The Reformed Church is the Protestants. Yeah, Protestant Reformed, Lutherans and Calvinists. Technically, you're right, it's another group, but I put them in the same category.
Anabaptists?
Oh, thank you! And my dad did it. I love you.
I hope so.
I was supposed to love him before he answered that question. Did you hear what he said? Something Baptist, right? Anabaptist, A-N-A. What does that mean? Again. People who baptize again. There were groups in the midst of all of this sectarian conflict who really reflected the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. They were the ones who were being killed by other groups who claimed to be Christians, but by the measure of the life and teaching of Jesus Christ, how could they claim to be Christians when they're killing someone else for their belief system? Did Jesus teach us to do that? No. I want a better no than that.
No.
No, he didn't. And we need to make sure that people understand that. If they're confused because they've been looking at Christians, Tim, and that's all they know, then more responsibility falls to us to say, hey, we need to talk. We need to talk because you've got the wrong idea. Haven't you ever read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Haven't you ever read that Jesus told Peter when they came to get him and he knew that he was about to be flogged, which is horrible. If you haven't seen that, if you don't know what flogging is, go look at that movie that'll make you weep before you can finish watching it. And then to be nailed to a tree and to left out naked to die. He knew all of that was happening. He told Peter to do what with that sword? He said, put it down. Now, that is the life and the teaching of Jesus Christ. Not the one who burned someone at the stake because they have a theological difference with them, and that's essentially what was happening in Europe. So who has a right to say that they were representing the life and the teaching of Jesus Christ in the 1500s and 1600s? It was not the Catholic Church. It was not the Protestant Church. It were little groups like the Anabaptists. We need to know these things so that when people bring this up, we can straighten them out and say, look, here, this is the life and the teaching of Jesus. This is how you measure Christians. Now, people are telling us that we're measuring Muslims improperly. That if we were to measure them by their leader and his writings, then we would draw a different conclusion. Their leader's name being? That's the God. Muhammad is the prophet. And the teachings of Muhammad in the writings called the Quran. Now, if we judge, by the way, along the same line, I couldn't help but notice this. Anybody out there know who Bill Maher is? Can't say his last name right. How do you say his last name? Maher. M-A-H-E-R. He's an interesting fellow. He's been on TV for 20 years or something like that. He's usually very anti-Christian. He calls himself an atheist sometimes, an agnostic at other times, but there's no love lost between him and Christianity. He was on the Charlie Rose show. Charlie Rose has a sort of a highbrow, intellectual talk show on PBS that'll really, it's one of those shows that if you're having insomnia, you can get up late at night and turn your TV on. It'll put you right out, and you're good. But he had Bill Maher, of all people, on his show, and Charlie Rose was saying that there's really no difference between Christians and Muslims. Now, if you haven't heard this yet, you need to get ready for it. Because it's been out there since what? Big event that happened in our lives, changed everything. Some of us were alive then. Thank you, 9/11. Within a couple of weeks, maybe even days, people came out and said, well, you know what? Christians are no different from those people. We blow people up too. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, we've blown up the Methodist church many times. You know, and the Methodists are always flying airplanes into our church. They found us out. We've got all our bombs down in the basements. There's nothing hidden anymore. But here's the funny thing about this. Maher, and I apologize for not saying his name right, began to defend Christians. Here's what he said. He said, vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you leave the Christian religion, you should be killed for it. What's he referring to? Muslims believe that when you leave Islam, guess what? You die. That's why we were praying for people like Abedini and others who have been thrown into prison because they were charged with leaving Islam, and they're supposed to be put to death. He also said this, vast numbers of Christians do not treat women as second-class citizens. Give me an amen, women.
Amen.
I feel bad up here. Is that all we got? You're not wearing any burqas or anything tonight, right? Some of you drove up here tonight, right? Some of you have actually been to high school and college, right? Okay. Vast numbers of Christians do not believe that if you draw a picture of Jesus Christ, you should get killed for it. Have you forgotten that? Not too long ago, tens of thousands of Muslims out in the streets killing each other for some picture that somebody drew in Denmark. So, yes, does ISIS do Khmer Rouge-like activities where they just kill people indiscriminately who aren't just like them? Yes, and would most Muslim people in the world do that or condone that? Well, Charlie Rose tried to argue with him. He said, most Muslims don't believe in that. And that's what we're told. Oh, Muslims don't believe in that. It's just a small group of minorities. Now, let me very quickly add that I believe there are probably some Muslims out there who just want to live their lives and want to be left alone. But I'm not sure they're the majority of Muslims. I don't know. I don't know. Just a second, Jack. Listen to this. Mao then quoted a Pew poll that was held in Egypt just a few years ago, noting that 82% of the respondents said that stoning is the appropriate punishment for adultery. Over 80% thought that death was the appropriate punishment for leaving the Muslim religion. 80% of the people in Egypt just a few years ago believed that it was right to kill somebody for leaving the Muslim religion. 80% is a pretty high number. Jack?
Well, they usually separate it into jihadist, holy war leaning Muslims, and then moderate Muslims, and then rank and file Muslims. And they always say, we're going to attribute all the worst of it to the jihadists.
Okay, so Jack is reminding us that they like to divide the Muslim world into jihadists, into modern Muslims, and then the rank and file, which I assume are people that aren't really that religious and don't care one way or the other. Kathleen?
Well, wouldn't it be right to say that maybe the moderates don't know what the Quran says?
It's possible that the moderates don't know what the Quran says, and the rank and file may not care. So let's think about this. If we're going to measure Christianity by the life and the teaching of Jesus Christ, and we're going to look at this parable and use it, but let's stop and ask ourselves for a minute, would it be fair to measure Islam by the life and the teachings of Muhammad?
You should. And if you're going to consider, if you're going to equally judge, if you're going to judge something, you should judge it by what it's based on.
All right, let's brush up on the life of Muhammad here for just a moment. Okay, I hate to do this, but the fact is we need to know this now because we're facing Islam, and we need to know a little bit about it. It's easier for us to talk about it and to dialogue with others. You need to understand that Muhammad was born about 600 years after Jesus. Okay, he was born in Mecca, in Arabia, and that's where he grew up. His family, people in his family died a lot when he was younger, and so he was passed around, raised by an uncle. And the world that he grew up in was nomadic tribes. that cultivated fields and herds, traders and merchants. The leadership was all male. The men had an unlimited number of wives and concubines. Female babies were often killed. Raiding each other's camps and herds was a form of warfare and competition. By the way, just as an aside, just a banner ad here for a moment, what other indigenous people also had a culture and a lifestyle that was based on raiding each other and warpath? The indigenous peoples of the United States of America. Not every group, but many of them. Just a little banner ad there. So it was the same kind of mentality. They grew up thinking that raiding is what you do. If you can overpower the other tribe and take away their assets, then that's just the way life works. Nobody questions that. So this is the world that he grew up in. He was born in 570 in Mecca, and he married at a relatively young age a wealthy widow and really didn't have to work for quite a while. And he began to get these visions that he wrote down that ultimately became the Quran. He was illiterate, and so he had to memorize them, and other people had to learn them from him and write them down. He literally couldn't write them down himself. And so that's where the Quran came from. But things began to change when this wealthy wife of his died. No longer did he have the protection that he once had, and the people in Mecca didn't like a lot of his teaching, and he began to be persecuted, and so he left. This is called the flight to Medina. It's important to people in Islam. He went to this other town, Medina, and here he had great success, and he began to build what would ultimately become Islam. But in this group, in this town, there was one group that he could never persuade and convince that he was a prophet. All of his people, the Arabians, not all of them, but a lot of them, were very impressed with him. But there was one group that never would accept him as a prophet. Anybody know who that group was? The Jews. There were 3 groups of Jews in Medina, and they knew the Old Testament. And when Muhammad started telling stories out of the Old Testament, it was kind of like some of the Hollywood movies we get nowadays, all jumbled up, messed up, wrong details, and they scratched their head and they said, "You can't be a prophet. You don't even know the Old Testament." They were measuring Muhammad by Moses and the law, because they're Jews. They're doing basically the same thing that we're talking about doing tonight, and so they're rejecting him. Now, this is important. I want you to leave here tonight with what I'm about to teach you. Okay? So listen very carefully to this. The Quran is very much unlike the Bible. It was written in just a short period of time, one man's life by one man. The Bible, of course, was written over a period of hundreds of years by about 40 different authors in 3 different languages on 3 different continents. And that in itself is one of the reasons that it's so impressive and miraculous, because it tells one story, even though it has all that diversity of writing in it. The Quran is nothing like that. It's a lot shorter. It's written by one man within about a 20-year period, and it doesn't even necessarily tell a story. It's an odd book. I'm not recommending that you read it. I tried to one time. It's a strange, different kind of book. But the first part of the Quran was written when he was still courting the Jews. And so he wrote things into his religion that was meant to impress them. Just one example. He said, when you pray facing, guess where? Not yet. Jerusalem. That's exactly right. You pray facing toward Jerusalem. Now, there were other things in there like that were meant to build bridges into the lives of the Jews, because he was trying to impress them and to get them to follow him as God's prophet. And he was building up all this time. He's building up a stronger and a stronger following. He's winning more and more battles. In fact, some of the homeboys back from Mecca came to Medina and tried to wipe him out, and he put them down. People were beginning to notice this guy and say, this man, he was strong, obviously. He was a strong leader. of men, but he taught them as part of their religion to raid and kill and to take women and to make them slaves. That was part of his religion, okay? His religion came with a sword from the very beginning. Two of the groups, there were three groups of Jews in Medina at this time. Two of the groups he expelled from the city. But after a great military victory, he saw an opportunity. So he took the 700 or 800 Jewish men that were still in Medina, this remaining third Jewish group, he took them outside of the city where there was a big pit. And guess what he did? You've seen ISIS doing it on YouTube recently. He cut off 700 heads of Jews. Maybe 800, somewhere between 700 and 800. Took the women for his men and for himself. Wiped out the whole tribe. If we judge Islam by the life of Muhammad, what does it say? It says that ISIS is Islam. It says that the Taliban is Islam. It says that the terrorists are Islam. Now that's unpopular to say. But these are facts that are indisputable. Even if you think I'm making this up to make Muhammad look bad, let me quickly let you know that this episode and all the things that I'm telling you tonight are accepted factual truth about Muhammad even within Islam. And they simply make apologies for the facts. Those who are supposedly moderate Islamic, moderate Muslims make apologies for the fact that he killed those 700 Jews. Well, you have to understand, Richard, that he really, really wanted them to follow him bad, and he was very disappointed when they didn't follow him. And he lived in a violent world, and so we shouldn't be surprised that he lashed out in violence. Well, Jesus didn't, and he lived in a violent world too. Look what they did to him. Jesus took a stand for what was going on in the world. Muhammad went along with what was going on in the world. Now, here's what I want you to know. It's a word called abrogation. Write it down. A-B-R-O-G-A-T-I-O-N. I want you to know this word, and I want you to know what it means. Abrogation. A-B-R-O-G-A-T-I-O-N. What I'm teaching you tonight, Muslims learn. I'm not teaching you anything that's off the track from what a Muslim would learn about the Quran and about Muhammad. I'm not presenting it the way that they would, but the facts are being presented in keeping with what they would present. And abrogation is a teaching that they accept about the Quran. After Muhammad realized that he was not going to be able to impress these Jews to follow him, he changed his tune. And he began to write new verses for the Quran. And no longer did you point toward Jerusalem to pray. Now you pointed toward where? He'd had it with Jews. That was it. Now here's what abrogation means. Abrogation means that when something earlier in the Quran is one way, and something later in the Quran is another way, guess what? You simply ignore the earlier writing. So when you hear people say, oh, but there's verses in the Quran that talk about loving people of the book. Yeah, they are. But they were written earlier. And they were abrogated by what was written later. And what was written later is what? Jihadism. Now that's important for us to know. And not everybody's going to jump up that's a Muslim and say that, because it makes it very plain what was happening. The exact reverse happens in the Bible. Gentlemen who are serving the table, if you come on up. We're beginning to prepare our hearts to worship the Lord Jesus Christ. A lot of people in the Bible like to look at the Bible and say, look at Joshua. He went into Canaan and he wiped out those innocent Canaanites. Well, first of all, I don't know if they're innocent. God didn't say they were. Nevertheless, he did. God sent him in there. And a lot of people struggle with that. The Bible is an unfolding revelation. It's an unfolding revealing of the character and the attributes of God. And as the Bible unfolds, the ultimate revelation of God, we're back to the beginning of our hour, is whom? Jesus Christ. So when we look at the Bible, when we look at Joshua and the Canaanites, we have to look through whom? Jesus. And we have to see where was Jesus on this. Now, I'm not saying the Bible uses abrogation, because it doesn't. Jesus never said that he was abrogating anything that happened in the Bible earlier. But he did say that he was fulfilling the Old Testament. And so there is movement in the revelation of the Bible. Clearly, the movement within the revelation of the Quran was from trying to reconcile to another group, to giving up with them, and then to killing them if they don't agree with you. The revelation of the Bible is what? It's toward Jesus, and Jesus is a man of what? He's a man of sorrows. He's a man who takes the world's suffering on his back. He is the Prince of Peace. He is the ultimate revelation. His life, his teaching, is what we measure Christianity by. So as we have this dialogue, as we listen to what's happening in culture, let's remember what Jesus says about who we are. We'll have to talk some more about it, but let's come to the